naturalist tradition of the time. But things were about to change, both in the artist's personal life and in the wider society of his home city. It would lead to a revolution in the art of Gustav Klimt. In 1892, Klimt's life was turned upside down. His father died, shortly followed by the deaths of his brother and studio colleague. It appears that Klimt was plunged into gloom by this double tragedy. He was, however, supported by his sister-in-law, Emilie Floge, as well as Vienna's cultural community. It was an exciting time to move in artistic circles. From 1890 onwards, an avant-garde movement began to flourish in Vienna. In literature, and later in art, a reaction developed against what was seen as the restrictions of naturalism. Intellectuals began to argue for a more suggestive, symbolic art that would express the deeper truths of the human condition. Gustav Klimt moved widely in avant-garde circles, and it was against this background that his work began to change.
In the early 90s, the younger painters in Vienna wanted to have access to more European art. They wanted to bring it into Vienna to be exhibited, which was not allowed at that time, and they also wanted to be able to exhibit their own art in other European venues.
And I think it's that restriction which was the thing that any young artist coming through clearly wanted to be able to voice their own views, and this was not allowed, and indeed they were simply not accepted. So in that sense I think that generally, including Klimt, there was a general, as there often is, a revolt against the establishment.
In the early years of the 1890s, Gustav Klimt spent more and more time in the Viennese coffee houses, surrounded by avant-garde ideas, which found their way into his work. As early as 1890, Klimt painted a portrait of the pianist Joseph Pembauer. The full meaning of the strange classical images in the framing is still debated today. Klimt's incorporation of the lyre can be interpreted as an allusion to harmony, as expressed through the notion of the tuned string. This was an important idea of Greek antiquity, reflecting the artist's enduring fascination with the ancients. And again, the lyre features in his 1895 canvas. Klimt painted music for the first time in 1895, a far cry from his earlier naturalism.
There is quite an element of allusion to Greek, archaic, Egyptian. And of course that ties in with his liking for a wide variety of academic art, including, for instance, in this country, Alma Tadema. But at the same time, the composition is going a bit wayward. It's going asymmetrical. It's going around to the edges, and it is including, and this is where we begin to see this surface decoration coming in.
Klimt started to move towards the flat, frieze-like composition that characterized much of his greatest work. His use of gold reached new heights.
He liked the ornamentation, of course, the decorative effects, and of course his father was a goldsmith, so he'd had some training early on in life in goldsmithing.
But gold does seem to have emerged at this stage at Music One as something which we can quite clearly see as he began to develop and work on. And of course, later on, other inspiration came to him from other sources which added to that.
By the time this sketch was completed in 1895, Gustav Klimt was moving towards the art of his maturity. The same year, he painted this memorable canvas, a representation of love. The image crackles with passion, with the sensation enhanced by the golden framing device. But it is also an attempt to convey something more than just the joy of love. Positioned above the embrace are bizarre female heads, symbols of the ages of womanhood. The presence of this terrible old hag looking down from the sky is a reminder that passionate love has its darker side.
It's his, if you like, fascination, if not obsession, with woman. You can link that, of course, with the whole business of the rise of the science of psychology and the whole business of sexual ethics and that. And we see here what emerges much later on, an ambivalent attitude towards women. Because you have got a painting here, mysterious, dark, ill-defined.
Unlike the Music One, which was done at the same time, it actually has quite a lot of symbolism in. The actual focus of the picture is on the two romantic people about to kiss. Fairly traditional, conventional. The man is very brown, the woman's very pale. She has her head lifted up in a traditional female submissive role.
We've got at the top of the painting the three ages of woman, very young, maturity and old age. And that is a theme which he comes to time and time again. It's very depressing, and I think a lot of his work can be seen to be very depressing, and I think that's also a reason why there's been an ambivalent attitude towards him.
Klimt was well aware of the ambiguous nature of eroticism. His enthusiasm to convey this message landed him in trouble, and he was condemned as little more than a pornographer. But when this canvas was completed in 1895, Gustav Klimt was still seen by many as the master of neoclassical decorative projects. That reputation secured him a commission to paint the ceiling of the Great Hall of Vienna's university. But the mammoth commission sparked the greatest controversy of his career. When the first fruits of his labor were revealed in 1901, the university authorities were outraged by the uncompromising boldness of his work. But they should not have been surprised. By the end of the 19th century, Klimt had become identified with everything radical in Viennese art, the Vienna Secession. In 1891, Klimt had been elected to the Künstlerhaus, the artist's house that dominated the Viennese art scene. This established institution owned the only exhibition hall in Vienna. Painters who wanted their work exposed to any sort of audience found themselves forced to compromise their art to fall in with the academic style of painting favored by the Künstlerhaus. Creative suffocation was not an unusual phenomenon at the time. It had been seen before elsewhere in Europe. French art was formerly dominated by the academic philosophy of the Paris Salon. But in 1874, the artists who became known as the Impressionists broke the stranglehold forever with the first of their historic independent exhibitions. But elsewhere in Europe, the old traditionalism lived on. In the Vienna of the early 1890s, paintings in the Impressionist style were still excluded from the Künstlerhaus exhibition. Eventually, the city's most liberal artists revolted. In 1897, 40 of them decided to form their own independent institution, with Gustav Klimt as its first president. This was the birth of the Vienna Secession.
The Vienna Secession, as it's called, is something which was really part of the spirit of the age. In Austria and Germany, for instance, in 1892, there was a secession at Munich. The Viennese secession was 1897, and then there was in Berlin in 1899. So in other words, it wasn't peculiar to Vienna, it was part of the spirit of the age.
The artists in Vienna, the younger artists, were dissatisfied with the lack of choice in their exhibiting venues and the lack of European input into their exhibitions. And this is why Klimt and a few others decided to set up their own group, which could have been accepted, of course, by the academic circles, but